Hi, I'm Sue from Garden Moxie. Welcome to my garden. Last night we got our first snowfall, which is always such a magical time in the garden. I thought it'd be a perfect time to show you some of the things that I've added to my garden so that I can have interest in the wintertime. So I've intentionally added some features in the garden so that the garden could still look like a garden in the wintertime. That was one of my goals several years ago when I started to add a lot of evergreen material and a lot of structure to the garden. And when I talk about that, there's a lot of things that you can leave in the garden that will still make it look like a garden in the winter. In one of my previous videos, I talked about this arbor, and you can see here, this is the classic example. We've just had our first snowfall, a magical time in the garden. And the arbor, even though it's been a hard frost and it's cold, there's really nothing growing. This vine is holding its own. You can tell that it's, adding some structure, and it creates a sense of enclosure in the garden and kind of makes it cozy even though it's cold. And those are the kinds of things that I want to add to my garden. So I love it when the garden is covered in a layer of snow. It was really exciting yesterday when we got our first snowfall. And when I talk about structure, you can see this garden has a lot of arborvitae and cedar hedging that surrounds the outskirts of the garden, so that gives it a sense of enclosure. The other great thing about that is it also creates a little bit of a microclimate because it protects from the winds in the wintertime. And then that way it almost feels cozier and warmer here. Not that it feels warm, but you get my idea. The beds that are surrounded in boxwood, they hold their own in the winter. Even when the snow is covering the boxwood, you can still see the structure of the garden. And so when I come out in the wintertime and I walk around in the garden, I can see just like the beauty of the garden. And in my mind's eye, I can see the garden in the summertime. So for me, one of the things that's the most fun in the garden is the little creatures that come, the squirrels, the chipmunks, the bunnies. I realize people don't like rabbits in the garden because they can be destructive, but in this garden, rabbits really aren't a problem. So I have usually one rabbit that always lives in the center section of the garden. That is true again this year. I can see tons of tracks from this morning, and when there's snow in the garden, that's the fun thing. You can actually see evidence, the tracks of the creatures that are the little bunnies and the animals that are living in the garden, and you can get a sense of how important some of the structure that you add to the garden is to the wildlife. So not only is it making it beautiful for you, it's also creating a little shelter for the animals. Now, the snow in the garden is also going to let you see some of the mistakes that have been made in the garden. Now, originally, before I planted, the trees that you see here are redbud trees, and they are completely covered with leaves in the springtime and in the summertime. So this area here is completely shady now. When the garden was young, I had a hedge of arborvitae. You can see the arborvitae hedge is not in good shape. And, when it snows, you've got all of the snow that will weigh down the branches. So if you do have hedging in your garden in the wintertime, it's super important that you don't allow, even though it looks beautiful, you need to get the snow off of the branches so that they don't damage the branches. Now, the thing about arborvitae is nature is remarkable. They're made to withstand some of this. I've seen arborvitae that have been completely bent over and go back into their shape because they're pretty pliable. But again, you don't want to risk that. So as these trees started to mature, the problem is that this hedge now, it doesn't get enough light. So this arborvitae hedge needs to be removed and replaced with something that can live in a lower light conditions, like a yew hedge as an example. Because I do like the idea of having the evergreen hedge to hide the fence. Another thing that you could do would be to put a screen in front of the fence that vines could climb on, so that you could pull the screen back to get access to the fence for maintenance, but that the vines could cover the fence so that you still had some green material during the winter months. So here's another example of an arbor, the one that is leading to the side yard. Now, the thing that I like about this is it kind of gives a sense of mystery, like you want to kind of go to the side yard to see what's in there. And it creates another room, so another structure, so that you can't see the garden all at one time. And I'm really loving the way that these vines, I've got honeysuckle on one side and chocolate vine on the other side. And these both maintain kind of an evergreen appearance in the wintertime. So again, you've got that sense of enclosure and a vertical element in the garden in the wintertime to give you some garden interest. So today I was hoping I would just share some of the things that I think work in a winter garden and help make it actually seem like a garden even though it's covered with snow and it's wintertime. And everybody always talks about structure in the garden, and let's talk about that a little bit. So in terms of structure, you can see that there is quite a bit of structure in the garden here. You've got the footpath, so even though it's wintertime, now of course when it's snow covered, you might have to sweep it, but the path still gives you a sense of walking in the garden. And the most obvious thing in my garden is the evergreens. So the boxwood, the arborvitae, the trees, all of these things help to keep the structure of the garden, so the outline of the garden. You can tell where the flower beds are even though it's wintertime. So that is a really helpful thing to still be able to enjoy the garden in the wintertime. Now, besides evergreen, there's a lot of different plants that you can keep in the garden that help you to have some interest in the garden. One of the most obvious are grasses. So here you can see the Japanese forest grass. Even though it's done with the season, it still gives you some interest in the garden. And lily turf is right behind it. Again, it gives you some interest in the garden. It's great to be able to have some colored branches. In this case, we've got the red-purple branches of the variegated dogwood, and those just look really pretty in the wintertime. And one of my favorite plants in the winter is epimedium. Epimedium makes a great plant in the wintertime. It stays evergreen here in Michigan. And look at that plant. You have definitely some interest in the winter. Now, I do keep a lot of things that I don't cut back in the wintertime so that I do have something to look at. One of them is the limelight hydrangea flowers. I try to keep some of them. Even though they're brown, they do give you some interest in the garden. Another one of my favorite things to do in the winter is just add some decor, if you will, to the outside garden. So here on the outside of our fence, I created just a really simple wreath made from wild grapevines and some arborvitae and also some dried hydrangea flowers. And then that just serves to act as a little bit of a decoration to the fence that leads into the back garden. And then when you open up the garden, you've got the path, and it just makes a nice entryway. It's kind of like, actually, it's kind of like opening up a door to a house. Thanks for joining me on a tour of the winter garden. I hope you found some things that were helpful so that you can see too that just because it's winter doesn't mean that you can't enjoy your garden. The garden's intended to be enjoyed all year round. Well, that wraps up a tour of the garden after the first snowfall. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.